Okay. What happens when the recipient spouse remarries or cohabits with somebody else?
Okay. Well, first on remarriage, hopefully they would tell the payor that they're remarried because the support is supposed to end, and it'd be a problem if they got remarried and kept receiving the support and didn't disclose their remarriage. They'd have an obligation to repay it.
Okay.
And cohabitation is a more difficult issue. There's a statute in the family code, and it tells us that there is a presumption of decreased need for support when someone cohabits with a member of the opposite sex. And so that's something people generally don't report, and payors often become suspicious. Is my former spouse living with their boyfriend or girlfriend sufficiently to meet that standard of cohabitation so that I can go back to court and request that the court terminate or at least reduce support? Again, the statute says a presumption of decreased need. It doesn't say absolute termination or zero. In my experience over the years in post-judgment modification proceedings, if the court determines that someone is cohabiting with a member of the opposite sex, they will set support at zero and perhaps even terminate jurisdiction. But that isn't necessarily what the result would be. And so often the issue is, what does it take to find cohabitation? Do people have to actually live together full time? What if they're traveling a lot together? And are there actually financial benefits? Sometimes people are cohabiting with someone who's actually dependent on them. And that person might be able to overcome the presumption of decreased need, although what I find is judges don't seem to be very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, okay. Can the roles of the provider and the recipient change?
Absolutely. And that's not uncommon, particularly in the troubled financial times we're in right now. Given our economy, we've seen a lot of unemployment, some long-term unemployment, and I've certainly seen cases where during the course of while you're in the temporary support stage, the party who's initially the payor becomes a recipient because they may have been the party with a good job, the other party was unemployed. 6 months later, there may be a reversal where the other spouse now has employment and the prior higher earning spouse is unemployed. And so it can go both ways, and the law is certainly written in a neutral fashion in terms of gender.
Okay. Are there substitutes for support?
Well, sometimes in a negotiated settlement, payors usually don't like to pay spousal support. That's an emotional issue. It doesn't feel good when someone looks at, perhaps either on an open-ended basis or for a significant period of time, paying out a big chunk of their money. It's often, it could be 40% of their net income would not be uncommon.
Ouch.
Yeah, and so that's a big bite, and so people will try and negotiate out of it, and sometimes you'll negotiate a buyout where one spouse, the payor, will pay some sum of money or additional share of community property, for example, in return for getting an absolute termination and termination of the court's jurisdiction, so they never pay it, or maybe they negotiate it so they pay a fixed amount for a finite period of time. And usually the way that's done is you try and determine what is the expected duration and the expected amount. That's not always easy, especially if it can be a long-term order, but sometimes you can pretty much tell, okay, maybe this is likely to be a 4-year order at so many dollars, so you determine the present value, tax discount it, and come up with a lump sum payment.
Okay. Is there a role for life insurance when providing for spousal support?
Yes, and it's not uncommon for either child or spousal support to have a requirement for the payor to provide life insurance on their life in a sufficient amount that would cover the support in the event of their death before the support would have ended. And sometimes that spouse remains the owner and actually provides the policy, and periodically will provide evidence that they're maintaining it. Or sometimes the other spouse will actually be the owner, and they'll say, fine, you can get a policy on my life, but you're going to pay the premiums. It's going to be your policy. Although a lot of payors don't feel terribly comfortable having a life insurance policy after their divorce where the ex-spouse would benefit by their death.
Yeah, well, okay. So we just have a few minutes left. Let's see here. I guess I'll go ahead with this question. Can a spousal support order be modified?
Yes, there are several types of orders that the court can modify. One of them is spousal support. Again, unless the people have agreed on a non-modifiable order, because sometimes by agreement there will be agreements that the court cannot modify, so it'll be a fixed amount for a fixed duration and only terminate on conditions that the parties have agreed on. Otherwise, the orders are modifiable based on changed circumstances, which most often might be the payor's loss of employment, or could be the recipient who previously was not employed, finishing school or training and becoming gainfully employed and allegedly being self-supporting.
Okay. So are there some key ideas that you have related to working out these settlements that can help people?
Well, a lot depends on the circumstances in the case. I think that if you're a payor after a long-term marriage, you want to take steps early to try and promote your soon-to-be ex-spouse becoming employed. Mm-hmm. And often what we will do is get a court order or an agreement to send the likely recipient of support to a vocational expert who will examine them, give them some tests and interviews, and then write a report about what jobs they might get immediately or what their long-term prospects might be with some additional education and training. That report can be useful in helping determine both the amount and duration, as well as what that recipient spouse should be required to do as a condition of continuing to receive their spousal support.
Okay. We've got about a minute, maybe a little less. Do you have maybe a final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us or in this area?
It's just a very difficult issue. It's an emotional issue, and it's something, if you have exposure to paying it, I guess you need to get over it and try and come up with a plan that will minimize your long-term exposure and try your best to see if you can get a termination date so there's light at the end of the tunnel. If you're a recipient, it's probably still in your best interest to try and maximize your own earning capacity because that other person may not always have a job and they may not always be around. They may die on you, and it's dangerous to be dependent on somebody else.
Yeah, well, that's probably the reason why I raised the life insurance issue. But life insurance does cost money, and some people aren't insurable.
That's right.
And so, so you may not have that backstop there, and so it's just really important to think about these, especially again these days. It seems like we've got people who've been married so many years, the empty nesters. Suddenly, then they're deciding, well, I'm going to move ahead now, and so then that's when these issues really come to the forefront.
And that's a very common time that people do get divorced.
Yeah. Okay, folks, we're out of time. So, Mark, I want to thank you again for joining me and sharing some of your knowledge in this area. Certainly a very important area because what? They say about half of the marriages in our country end in divorce. Darn. So, folks, think very seriously again when you're making this marriage decision in the first place. And again, we want to encourage you to think very seriously about whether you can work it out. But sometimes you don't have that choice. In that case, you've got some information to help you to make a start. But do seek good professional guidance. And with that, I hope I'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.